happens when you have a history degree from Yale University, are in love, don't know what to do with your life, but just want to be happy? Find out when I interview Professor Charles Eisendrath.
That's good.
Hello everybody, and welcome back to Uncommon Sense. We are on location up north in northern Michigan in beautiful Charlevoix. With me today is a person I've admired for a very long time, Professor Charles Eisendrath.
Thank you.
Thank you. Charles has had a wonderful, wonderful experience. He went to school at Yale, where he is a major in history, and later received his master's from the University of Michigan in journalism. He was a practicing journalist and then became a teacher, or at least affiliated in 1975 with the University of Michigan's Journalism School. Currently, he is running the Knight Fellows program, which is a wonderful program for 18 people, senior people in journalism, who have the opportunity to have a sabbatical, that is to say, a leave from their profession. They are American internationals, and they have an opportunity to broaden themselves in ways, I guess, of their own choosing.
Yes, absolutely.
You don't boss them around.
I boss them around too.
He has an analogous program for people in the early part of their careers called a Livingston program. So I would like to know, the world is full of opportunity. What fascinated you about journalism?
It's interesting you ask, because in the beginning, nothing fascinated me about journalism. I didn't really know what it was. I was in law school, and I was in law school because my much admired grandfather, maternal grandfather, had been a lawyer, and I didn't have a clue what I wanted to do. But my father at that point had sold his business and become an art historian, and that didn't seem right. And so I started in St. Louis because my girlfriend, being a young woman, was reasonably well organized, and of course I, as a young man, was completely disorganized. And she got a job in our hometown, St. Louis. And so that's clearly where I was going to be for the summer. And I shouldn't say girlfriend, fiance. And so this was a big deal. I would have to get my kit together, as we say. And so for the first, really and only time, I called up my father and said, "Who do you know? I need help here. This is family honors on the line. I don't have a clue." And he had helped Joe Pulitzer catalog his art collection. So he called up Joe Pulitzer, who owned the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and said, "I have a ne'er-do-well son who needs some help. Can you take care of this?" Or something like that. And I don't know what Joe Pulitzer said, but I was told to report to the Post-Dispatch on some day, and I didn't have a clue whether I would be delivering papers or selling advertising or maybe be a reporter or run the elevator. I didn't have a clue. And I really had never seriously read a newspaper, so I didn't know anything. And out of that, and over the course of that summer, I fell out of love with the fiancée, broke up, and in love with journalism, to give you a long answer to a short question.
I think it was the beginning answer, actually, but what intrigued you about the process?
Oh, I loved it. I found out that I'm curious about everything. And what better job for someone like that than to be paid to be curious about everything. And it never disappointed me. I've loved it since that first summer and continue to love it. Didn't like law school at all. I was afraid I would contract a legal mind. I regard it as a sort of disease. And I couldn't take it seriously because the law cases, some of which I loved, are great stories. But then the idea that some judge would sit down and distill some cosmic rule of behavior from what people's stories had told them over the course of several centuries struck me as just silly. So I loved the stories. And with a law school classmate of mine, who was a wonderful artist, we put out a little self-published or unpublished Hampton's Illustrated Torts, which illustrated these stories in personal confrontations. And I wish to hell we really had published it. We just put together, in those days, mimeograph sheets.
Was that the early sort of grounding for your Humor at Michigan program?
Could have been, but my whole life was. I think humor is tremendously important. I've always used it as a journalist, either to put people at ease or to get at them, find out who they are. It's a very powerful tool, as you know, because you've got it too. And so that was a natural phenomenon.
How do you do humor with a person?
It depends on what the situation is. If you're trying to talk your way out of a traffic ticket, for example.
Yes, I want to hear about that.
Or it doesn't work. Or if you need something or want to offer something, it's useful for almost anything, I find.
Do you think your curiosity extends across the board, or do you?
Across the board. There's I always find something of interest. It's impossible to think that I wouldn't. And I think in a totally deprived environment, it's like, let's say, a jail cell, I don't know what I would do. I'm not the sort of person who would recite Milton. I get curious about what I see.
You might interview your cellmate.
I would certainly do that.
Well, what took you from being a practicing journalist to sort of the teaching side? What call did you have, or disappointment?
Very good question. At that point, the short answer is I ended up doing what I wanted to have done by 50 at about 33. And so I was totally baffled. Okay, well, what now? I was at that point a foreign correspondent in Paris, which was my lifelong dream. This is what I wanted to do forever. And in the 70s, news organizations like to move people around. Mm-hmm. In the 50s and 60s and even before, you would get to Paris and you'd stay there. Mm-hmm. And you would blend into the local environment. You would become in part French or English or Chinese, wherever you were. And that was a very appealing kind of life. By my day, it was incredibly hectic and a lot of travel and unpredictable travel. Mm-hmm. And just about the time you felt comfortable with what you're talking about, they moved you, because the theory was fresh eye. Mm-hmm. And that's insane. And it was a result of the managers themselves being moved around more frequently than they had been. And so that was, if you happen to be married, very tough, because you'd come back from a war or something where you made very intense relationships. Mm-hmm. And why should your spouse be interested in this? Only on a superficial way. And it was a sort of life where you don't attend your own dinner parties. And that's not cool.
Because you weren't there.
You're not there. Mm-hmm. And so we had 2 kids born on the road, one in England and one in France. And we needed a time to think. Mm-hmm. And I do mean we. And I won a fellowship. And Time magazine, where I was, said, well, that's nice, but we were in Paris and we need you in South America. And I said, I don't know where South America is. I don't speak Spanish. You say Argentina, I'm sure it's a very important place. But why don't you talk to someone who actually knows where it is? And they said, well, we're talking to the person we want to go. And if you do this for a year, then we'll back you for a fellowship next year. So I had applied at Michigan and Stanford. And I wanted to go to Michigan. And I asked Michigan if they would hold the slot, and they laughed, and so I had to reapply the next year. So we went to Buenos Aires, and that's the way I got into it, was through that fellowship. I saw what a professor is or could be, and what their life is. And by the end of the fellowship, I hadn't meant to do this. It was sort of like journalism for me. I didn't know what a professor did particularly. I thought, you know, at a place like Michigan, you can spend your whole life in the library or never go to the library. You can spend your whole life teaching or hardly ever teach. You can spend your whole life doing research or not do, well, you really do have to do research. And you can change jobs. But the only difference is, instead of a foreign correspondent changing language, changing total job skills, changing all your friends and your dry cleaner, as a professor, you can do all kinds of things and don't change anything except what you do that day. And in a funny way, it was very much like the best part of journalism.
So you kept the framework of your life, but you also managed the time and focus.
I did.
Which was perhaps quite different than...
I learned the most important thing for me was not money. The most important thing was control of my time. And Julia and I also realized that year that we were not geniuses. And in that profession, you know everybody. It's a tiny little profession. I don't know what the comparable size would be for other endeavors, but tiny. I mean, a few hundred, maybe a couple hundred in my era. And you knew them all, and you know their marriages. And we thought, no, I don't think so. They didn't look good.
They didn't stay stable.
They didn't stay anything. And whatever they stayed didn't look like a lot of fun. And we wanted to stay together. And at the end of the year, we decided, I guess it was my call, to stop following this job, which I had adored and which Julia loved. Julia loved the life too. It just wasn't going to work long term, and our kids were becoming international brats. We didn't like that, or would. They were too young to do that. And so I held my nose and jumped ship. And we had no job. I took, it was terrifying.
You had no job?
When I quit time, I had no job. I was on this fellowship, and before I had located anything, the year was over. Well, what do you do?
What do you do?
Well,
what did you do?
You panic, of course.
Right, of course.
We had these two little kids, some savings, but not enough to do nothing on. And it was funny. I ended up behaving pretty much the way I always had. I told Michigan that I would like to stay and teach there, and they said, "Well, good. How would you like to get a PhD?" And I said, "Well, I wouldn't. I wouldn't be caught dead with a PhD. No foreign correspondent has a PhD." And they said, "Well, we don't hire anybody without a PhD." So I did what you would do. I called up everybody I could think of, including someone at the University of Wisconsin, journalism department or school, and said, "Well, Michigan won't have me. How about you?"
Right.
And I went over there, and they said, "Absolutely, here's your job." So, but I wanted to stay close to our place up here,
yes,
if I could.
Overlook Farms.
So I went back to Michigan and said, "Well, I guess I'm moving to Madison." He said, "What? They're going to hire you?" I said, "Yeah." They said, "Oh, well, then you can be hired here."
What a lesson.
Said,
huh?
No, it wasn't. It was just like Time and Newsweek or the New York Times and the Washington Post. Exactly the same in my case.
But you can create an opportunity.
Of course. I mean, once you demonstrate that there's competition out there, everything changes.
How did you handle your fear of jumping into the unknown like that, in that intermediary?
Probably not very well. But the job they offered was a tenure track job, and I was, excuse me for saying so, but when you were a Time correspondent in the 70s and 70s, this was a job akin to what networks are now.
Uh-huh.
When you went to some place, the celebrity news service would announce that you were there. and people would call you.
Heady.
It's very heady stuff. And so I thought it was a pretty big deal. You know, the bureau chief, Time magazine.
Whew.
And Michigan said, no, we don't do that. You're going to be an assistant professor, and your salary is going to be X, which was 2/3 what I was making. Never mind the expense account, which didn't exist. And you're going to have to get tenure the old-fashioned way. Don't even talk to us about tenure. So I found myself writing for publications with a readership of 400. I've been writing for 4 million.
Right.
And it was required that I write in academies, which means say in 4,000 words what I knew I could say in 40.
Right.
And it just about killed me. I did it, and I almost died. I found myself so furious. Not that they wanted me to become a real professor, I mean the real way, but at the writing in academia, I thought was just appalling. Still do.
Attenuated. Yeah.
Ridiculous.
Well, you've mentioned Julia several times.
I tend to.
Well, that's good for both of you and me as well. How did she come into your life?
The way almost everything has, on a blind date. I was working for the Baltimore Evening Sun. Michigan had placed me on an internship there. I guess I should backtrack there. I was in Baltimore because of the Evening Sun, and also because I found a reserve unit there, and I had no intention of going to Vietnam. I was in the National Guard. I joined the National Guard there, and knew exactly what I thought of it, and was not a conscientious objector or anything like that. But there I was, and there the Evening Sun was, and I had very bad luck. I would say no luck finding women I wanted to date. Or I guess I had some luck, just not very much.
What did you look for in a woman?
I had no clue. Somebody who would go out with me.
That's a good basic.
And so I asked the guy at the next desk what do reporters do. He was married, and our families had been friends for a long time. His name was Adam. And I said, okay, Adam, this is now, and his wife's name was Gabby. I said, this is a job for Gabby. I've failed. I'm hopeless. And so they fixed me up. And this was not someone I wanted to spend another 5 seconds with. So I came back from that experience and said, okay, friendship's on the line. This was a disaster. You got to do better than that. And they did. So they produced Julia, and she was not too clear about what a good idea this was, the blind date. But she would tell you a different story. But I walked into the room, and in very short order, I'm talking a few minutes, thought, wrap it up. I'll take it. So
interesting.
This I announced to her very quickly, and took her a while to come around. But we were married. This was in June. We were married the following January, with me utterly furious about how long this whole process had taken. Struck me as nonsensical and ridiculous. It didn't have to take that long.
But it's interesting for someone who is curious. There was hardly any check. It was like immediate. No. What was the immediacy that confirmed or directed that decision? Can you say?
No, it's not unrelated. I know a good story the second I see it. I don't have to ask many questions. And the questions are, okay, how is this story going to be flushed out? But I know if it's a good story by immediately.
But you haven't said how. How do you know it's something?
Instinct. I don't know. And as I've gotten older, I used to be very embarrassed about that, because I would say something in a discussion and people would press me for an answer. And I had a pretty good education. And I'd been taught that you either have an answer or you don't, you have nothing to say. Older, further on, I realized that's ridiculous. And now, or for years now, I've been saying, I don't know. I don't know. I can't give you an answer. But you ask me a question. I mean, I can't give you a reason, but here's the answer. And in a few minutes, few hours, few days, I get the reason. And if it's relevant, then I can discuss it.
Do you think other people make decisions that way, or do you think this is a gift you have?
The lucky ones.
A lucky
The
gift.
lucky ones. The lucky
ones are like that.
I think so. I'm sure there are lots of people who don't have much respect for that way of thinking. That's fine. But that's the way I operate, and that's the way a lot of people I know operate. And I think an awful lot of journalists do. I don't know whether more of us than others, but artists certainly do. I have a son who's an artist, and he knows. And I've just I'm no longer embarrassed about it. I think it's instinct, and instinct is just as powerful a tool as anything else you're going to use.
Interesting. What do you yearn for?
What do I yearn for? Well, the audience can't see it, but that car, I'm not a car person, but just before my 60th birthday, I realized that I was having a very good life, but there was something missing, and that was the sound that only an English motor from the 1960s makes. It's a kind of snarl. And when I was a kid, I had an MGB. And since I'd never paid any attention to cars after that, I tend to drive trucks and not very new ones. I thought, well, I'll just go to a sports car place. So I took Julia to the local, it's called Autostrasse in German, in Ann Arbor. It's where all the fancy car dealers are. And we ended up in a BMW M5 or something, racy little thing. And we hated it. I particularly hated it. I thought it was just a ridiculous car. First place, I felt like an old guy in a young guy's car. And secondly, the car was a sports car. It was an absurd car. The top went up and down and sealed. Who would want that?
Right.
The windows worked. Yuck.
Right.
Didn't want any of that. Made no sound. And it was air conditioned. All of these were just the height of stupidity as far as I was concerned. So I was baffled for several months because I knew it was cooking back there what I really wanted. I just couldn't put it in words. And finally, in the early spring, I realized that I'd only loved one car my whole life. The only problem was that I'd never seen one up close or certainly ridden in one. But that didn't matter. It was a Morgan. And I didn't have the money to buy it when I got the MG. And every time I saw a Morgan over there someplace, I'd think, oh my God, this is fabulous. But I hadn't thought about it at all for maybe 30 years. And so I began asking my car friends. Everybody in Michigan has car friends. They said how difficult it was going to be and how terrible the car was and unreliable. And it would take me a year and a half and blah, blah, blah. And I should join a club first. And I didn't much like the car clubs. It's the people who kept their cars on blankies and never used them. And I thought, I don't want to do this. So I went back to the same people and said, okay, this is not my technique. Where do you find Morgans for sale? They said, right. Hemmings Automotive News.
And there you went.
New publication to me. Went to Borders, found this 2-inch thick thing printed on old-fashioned English export newsprint. Looked under M, found 5, called them all, found out what they cost, and then had a funny experience. I was here, and I was about to go to Iceland for a week. So I called this guy up, the dealer, and said, I'd like to put a down payment on this car, and I'll come see it in a week. Fortunately, it was in Chicago and not Kuala Lumpur. And he said, well, we only take full payment, so I'm not going to hold it. And this was the color I wanted, and I by that time figured out what model I wanted, and I wanted something from the 60s. I'm from the 60s. I wanted a car to match. So I couldn't figure out what to do about this. So I finally put the full price in escrow and called this guy back and said, okay, I'm talking to you from East Jordan, Michigan. East Jordan is very close. As a matter of fact, it's the hometown of the man who runs the Michigan militia. And I'm wearing camo right now, which I was, because it just happened to have it on. And there's a guy in the next barn who's going to come with me, and we're going to come see you. And if that car is not exactly what you say it is, it's a 6-hour drive, it doesn't do exactly what you say it is, you're going to have a really unpleasant afternoon. and he laughed. He said, the car's exactly what I say. I said, good, then we'll all be friends. And we drove down. Of course, it was just a guy who worked on the cherry pickers in the next barn. We went down. I drove it around the block. We put it on the trailer and drove it home.
Charles, in the remaining second we have to talk, I love your philosophy of life, which is sort of live your dream, right? And take the risk to do it. What actually did you think about teaching your boys, your children?
The same thing. Love it. Don't do it if you don't love it.
I want to thank Charles for being with us today. We have learned a great deal, and that is sometimes we don't know where we're going, but we end up in the right place.
That's a good way to put it.
Because he had an interest in a girlfriend, he ended up in journalism kind of on a fluke, found out he loved it, and what he loved about it was that he could satisfy the curiosity that he is naturally endowed with or prefers to live with. He also found out that he makes decisions across a full range of data. That is to say, not only what he can learn intellectually, but what he learns almost in a sixth sense about the rightness of things. He talked about that in terms of where there is a story, and because I was asking him about his wife, where he knew almost immediately that...
Not almost.
Immediately? Immediately. We need to revisit that. And to be able to pull from that, from your full range of experience decision making, it's often good to think things out, but it's also good to take from within when we have a sense of things. Just don't overdo that too much, okay? The other thing that you can see that he really lives by is a sense of love of life, the sense of, I won't call it passion, but the excitement and the way to bond with people through humor. But he is always really teaching. Your story of his car is a teaching. Don't let me down. Let me live it the way I'm hoping, and can you meet that dream? And to live life and love it, as he was saying in the last few minutes, is really a basis of life. If you can find in your life that which you love and live it, you do have the gift for a happy life. I wish you a wonderful week, and remember, kindness counts. Go out and do something kind today for someone you know and someone you don't know. And we'll see you next time. And thank you so much, Charles.
My
It was a
pleasure.
pleasure.